I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Fred Spier. He is a senior lecturer in Big History, emeritus, at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Spier received a master's in science and biochemistry with distinction at the University of Leiden and a PhD in cultural anthropology and social history at the University of Amsterdam. Fred is one of the pioneers of Big History. You may have heard of Big History. Bill Gates gave one of their organizations a $10 million grant to promote it. And I'll let him speak a lot more about Big History, but he's one of the chief published authors in the Big History field and has lectured on Big History across the world. Speaking of interdisciplinary, Dr. Spier has performed research in a wide range of academic fields, including the genetic manipulation of plants, religion, politics, and ecology in Peru, structuring and explaining Big History, and as well as many specific themes. You may have seen the title of his talk. You're thinking, is there anything he doesn't study? And maybe there's not, I don't know, but I'll leave that to him. Without further ado, I'm Dr. Fred Spier.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for your kind invitation and introduction. So yes, I'm looking at the world. I'm looking at everything in terms of what has become known as Big History. The term was invented by Australian historian David Christian, who started a revolutionary university course that started with the Big Bang and then went through the history of the universe, history of our planet, history of life, and the history of humanity. And he started that course in 1989, and we in Amsterdam copied that course and adapted it to our own possibilities and limitations. And we started our first course in 1994, and it is still running. So that is how we started thinking. But in order to explain what I have to say in terms of energy, complexity, entropy, and I really wonder whether I have actually anything new to say to you, because I'm sure I'm facing experts, but I'll try anyway. I would like to go back to first my study of chemistry. When I was doing that in the 1970s, we became far more aware of ecological issues that we were facing. And I could not really see how the study of chemistry would really help us to find answers to those questions. Because I realized that those were social questions, first of all. We were doing it together with people. And therefore, I decided to start a social study, and I wanted to get a worldview, and I thought cultural anthropology would provide such a worldview. So that's what I did, and that's why I went to Peru to live with the local farmers and see how they were dealing with the ecology. That was the idea. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. And it was not only about what was happening when I was there, but I also tried to trace their history. And that immediately raises the question, how do you do that? And I was so fortunate to be part of a research group that were thinking in terms of processes, very systematically in terms of processes. Everything can be seen as a process. Your own life, the history of Peru, the history of our planet, the history of the universe can all be seen as processes. And within that group, there were some of us who were trying to develop also, let's say, more of the theory of processes. But still, I would say, if you think about history writing, is there any handbook of how to write history in terms of processes? I don't know it. I think what we're looking at here is a real big gap in our knowledge. And I was very fortunate to be part of a group that started thinking and theorizing about processes. And that very much shaped my thinking. So when we started to do Big History in the early 1990s, I realized that you could also look at Big History, the history of everything, in terms of a process or a set of processes, interrelated processes. And that actually our course provided a model for these processes. And we have all these lectures by all these different specialists lecturing about Big Bang cosmology, the stars, the planets, the galaxies, etc., all the way down to human history, then you see all these sets of interrelated processes that you don't have to really worry about academic boundaries. Yeah, big history doesn't really show them. I mean, they are basically human-made, these boundaries. So because I started thinking in terms of processes when I was doing my Peru research, it was quite natural for me to think in terms of processes about big history. And that's what I wrote my first book about. It's called The Structure of Big History. I'll show it to you. I don't want to advertise it. It was published in 1996. But that was my answer to how to conceptualize big history. But we were still left with the question, how can you explain it? Are there any underlying principles that we could think of that could help us to explain big history? And that was a challenging question. And for years, I thought I'd never find an answer. But when the internet started to emerge, and for me, let's say, real access started around 1998. Is there a problem?
Oh, Fred, let me do a quick question. How many of you know what big history is? Or would you like Fred to tell you? I'm not sure the levels of familiarity.
Didn't I explain it enough? Or, I mean, anybody who wants to ask questions, please do so.
From what I'm tracking, can everyone hear me? From what I'm tracking is that big history is the method of studying essentially the history of the world beyond, well, it's history of the world, starting all the way from the beginning into the Big Bang, while also incorporating not only civilizations, but also in terms of energy, the flow of energy, things of that nature, and tries to incorporate many different academic fields and many different studies in order to study the processes of history. Is that correct?
Well, yes, sort of, although I would say that some people would put more emphasis on energy flows than others. But the idea is to provide an integrated history of everything from the Big Bang until today. So of the entire universe, of our galaxy, our solar system, our planet, all of life, and the whole development of all of it. And of course, that's a very challenging project, and nobody can claim that we can do it really well. We are still at the beginning of formulating this idea, but at the same time, I think it cannot be denied that, yes, there is such an integrated history. We are part of it. No denying it if we take seriously all the academic views as they have developed since the 1960s with Big Bang cosmology, with plate tectonics, and name it. So by doing all of that, you can at least think of an integrated history, and you can wonder about how to do it. And that's what we've been doing over the past 30 years. And I would say it's still very much a field in development, and really a lot is still possible. But at the same time, I think we have made great progress. When we started out, we couldn't find any books about big history. We thought it didn't exist. So we started basically with making a syllabus with a set of separate articles that might be appropriate for our students. But over the past 25, 30 years, we've seen increasing integration. And one of the nice things about big history is if you look at things really big, then you see big patterns that escape the attention when you look small. I can give you a simple example. I brought you the Earth. Here's the Earth. Right, let me see whether I can rotate California into view. I'm sure I'm getting it right. Let me see.
Although Parker's in Maryland.
Okay,
he's in
no,
the East Coast.
here's yeah, I see everything in mirror image. That's my problem. So that's, but here's California, I think. Anyway, but what you see is when you look at it from a distance, you see all these coastlines, you see the continents, you see the big patterns, which you cannot see if you're sitting in your room. Perhaps you don't even have a window, you cannot look outside. it's impossible to see these patterns. You know they exist because other people told you so. But in order to see them, you have to take distance, right? And that's the same with history. If you take distance and you look at all of history, you see patterns that would remain obscured if you look too closely to it, if you focus on too many details. I'm not saying that looking at details isn't good, it's very important. But taking distance is also very important to see the big patterns. And I think that is one of the big revelations of studying big history, that we suddenly start seeing such big patterns. And that is also what I would like to focus on. Just like I said something about these large processes that you can think of big history as consisting of a number of processes, which immediately raises the question, which processes and how do they interrelate? I'm not going to talk about that now, but you would not ask that question if you were just studying, let's say, San Francisco history or Amsterdam history. You might think of smaller patterns if you wanted to do that, but even then you would have to take some more distance, because you cannot understand San Francisco history without California history, without US history, and in fact, without world history, I would argue. So then you would also have to think about all these patterns at different scales, all these processes. So that's the way I tend to look at history, and it's also big history. So also I had become acquainted by that time with thinking in terms of complexity, as was then primarily done at the Santa Fe Institute, that you're probably familiar with. And I was fortunate to be able to visit them in 1996, almost exactly 25 years ago, it was also in October, to present that little book of mine there, in the hope that there would be some interaction and conversation. But I don't think the interest was overwhelming. They rather preferred to think about their own projects, I think. But I learned a lot there about how they were thinking about complexity. And I don't know if you're all familiar with the concept, but how would we define complexity?
I've asked. I haven't heard a good answer.
It's difficult, isn't it? But I think one could say that it's something of which the whole is more than the sum of its parts. I mean, that is a fairly established way of describing it. And I usually explain that to my students as well. You know what, we all exist of thousands of different chemical compounds. What if we all separate them, put them in little vials on many tables, because probably would need many tables. And that would be us, right? But then separate it into all these little vials. Would it be possible to put all those chemical compounds together again and get you and me again? And the answer is very, very unlikely. And that immediately explains what the difference is between the sum of the parts, that the whole is more than the sum of all these separate chemical compounds. And that's in general the idea of complexity, that it gets its proper, its own properties, so to speak. So I started thinking along those lines, and then when I was living in Laguna Beach in Southern California, a little south of where you are, I started exploring the internet, which was then clearly emerging. And then there was a site named Amazon, which was primarily still a bookstore. And what they were doing is they were adding secondhand booksellers to the site, which certainly opened up a treasure trove for me, because I could type in keywords related to big history and see whether any books would come up. And they did. So I suddenly started finding several scholars in the United States, especially, who had been doing similar things and of whom we had no idea. And the one who struck me the most was an American astrophysicist, Eric Chason, whom I and I saw two of his books, and I thought, hey, that looked like the history. So I ordered them, and I read them. I thought, oh, that's wonderful. This man has preceded us with about 2 decades. So I contacted him through email, which you could also find, and invited him to give a lecture in our course, which he did in Amsterdam. And then he was writing a book. It was this book. It's called Cosmic Evolution: The Rise of Complexity in Nature. So he was also thinking in terms of complexity, and he asked the question, how is complexity possible? And I guess if you are familiar with, let's say, the non-equilibrium or out of equilibrium thermodynamics by Ilya Prigogine, the Russian scientist who spent most of his life in Belgium, then you know what answer he gave, and that is also what Eric Chasen based his work on. That basically, if you want to get complexity, you need to. He's an astrophysicist. He still teaches at the Harvard Astronomical Observatory. I've also been at his invitation. But anyway, so he was asking the question, if you have a universe as it evolves, how is it possible to get complexity? Well, you would expect everything to basically disintegrate, given the second law of thermodynamics, that you would expect everything to become more chaotic, so to speak. And the answer is that in certain areas in the universe where you get sufficient concentration of matter, if there are sufficient energy flows, you can get complexity. And that is what Eric traced in rough lines in his book. I think it's a pioneering book, and a little hard to read because it contains lots of formulas. But thanks to my chemistry education, I wasn't too frightened to tackle that. But I do think that he provided a conceptual framework that I think is very valid. Yet at the same time, when I was looking at it, I kept a nagging feeling it's not enough for me. So there I had a bit of a problem, and then suddenly, when my American wife Gina here was cooking a nice Italian meal, she is Italian descent, I realized, hey, she asked me the question, how do you explain all that? And I thought, oh, that's how it works. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about. The answer seems to be very simple, but with enormous implications. And the point is that if you have this matter that needs its energy flow to get complexity, then you also need special circumstances that favor that. And these special circumstances depend on the type of complexity. So let's say for you and me, we are okay here on the surface of this planet, at least for the time being, but we wouldn't want to be, let's say, 10 miles down or 20 miles up. Those there, the conditions are certainly not right for us. But if we move, let's say, 20 miles left to the south or to the north, it may not be so much of a problem. So you can see that, let's say, on the surface of the Earth, there are certain good conditions. Following a suggestion by David Christian, I began to call Goldilocks circumstances that favor the type of complexity that we are. But they're not good for the sun, for instance. Sun is also a type of complexity. And the sun needs very different circumstances to remain what it is. It needs a lot of dark, cold, empty space around it. Because if it doesn't have that, it cannot get rid of its radiation, its entropy, that is produced by nuclear reactions, fusion reactions in its core that sort of keep the whole thing going the way it is. But it needs to get rid of that radiation, because if it didn't, if you were to put a blanket around it, so to speak, it would explode. So it needs a lot of cold, dark, empty space. Now, do we need that too? And the answer is yes. But not exactly where we are, but we also get rid of our entropy, our radiation, to a considerable extent by radiating it out into space. And thanks to the temperature differences that there are between, let's say, the surface of the Earth and outer space, we can do that. So what we get is incoming radiation from the sun that powers all the plants and that animals eat, and we eat both, and then that keeps us going. To just mention a few things, that but all of us need to radiate out low level radiation too. And you can feel it right away. If you hold your hand close to your other hand, you feel the warmth radiating out, and that is basically entropy you're trying to get rid of. If you put yourself in a spacesuit and you completely isolate yourself, you also explode. That's also why spacecraft need radiators to get rid of their entropy. So you always see this interplay between energy, complexity, entropy. You see it everywhere. And I realized that here we had a pattern, including these Goldilocks circumstances, that could provide what I saw as a convincing structure for explaining big history. So if you start out with the Big Bang, you can look at the Goldilocks circumstances for that. You don't have a clear answer to that because you don't really know what the Big Bang was. But as soon as everything starts expanding and cooling down and the first particles form, then we see, for instance, you need really high temperatures and high pressures for all these elementary particles to form. Those were the Goldilocks circumstances for that to happen. It doesn't happen in your backyard. But it did happen then. And it does happen also to some extent inside stars, where you actually see some kind of circumstances that are to some extent reproducing early universe circumstances, say. So if you start looking at the universe in such a way, and by the way, I brought you the universe just to get an idea. Here it is. And it's not expanding, at least I haven't seen it expand. That's a bit of a limitation. But it's good to have an idea of, okay, this is what we can see. This is how we look at the universe. And we see all these stars and these constellations as we see them from Earth. There's hardly any other way we can look at that, even if you, let's say, looking at from the Voyager spacecraft, the universe wouldn't look very different. The universe is really, really big compared to the Earth. But so we have to think about, if we try to think about a general scheme underlying everything, it must be able to accommodate the entire universe and its entire history. Unfortunately, that is what this complexity and energy entropy approach does. You can apply to everything immediately from the Big Bang all the way down to our own lives, including our ecological problems, because you can also formulate them in very basic, simple ways in such terms. So that is what I wrote my book about. It is this book, I may want to advertise that it's called Big History and the Future of Humanity. And that is where I propose such a general scheme in terms of complexity, energy, entropy, and Goldilocks circumstances. And I think I was a little scared when I did that, because it was somehow, it hadn't been done before, even though it seems so totally obvious, but nobody has thought about it, to do that systematically. But now I think people are more accepting that this may be a good idea. But still, I would say what we have here is an underlying scheme that applies to all of big history, but it would certainly not argue that it therefore is the only one and only explanation of big history. I see it as an important underlying scheme that is present in everything that has happened and everything we're doing, and I think in everything that will happen in this universe. But it does not mean that therefore other theories are superfluous. Because I think that every level of complexity may require its own level of theory. You can, for instance, think of Darwin's theory of natural selection. That is a theory of, let's say, the complexity at the level of life, of plant, animals, where it seems to work very well, and you cannot really reduce that to the level of what I just said. But at the same time, that general theory is certainly part of it. So that raises the question, how would those theories interrelate? And what about plate tectonics? Plate tectonics is also typically a theory of higher complexity in this case. The tectonic plates of the Earth as they're moving around and how that works. So it's totally applicable to Earth. It's not applicable to any other planet that we know because they don't have plate tectonics. So why not? And how would it work here and why would it work there? I mean, all these questions can be raised and are being raised, obviously. So there you see that different levels of complexity may require different, let's say, relatively autonomous theories, but they must interrelate in some way or the other. And the same applies to human history or human societies. Because I was trained as a social scientist, I became familiar with theories of how societies work. And these are also, let's say, relatively autonomous theories, as the great German sociologist Norbert Elias called it. And so what we need to think about is how all these theories interrelate. How does that work? I'm not going to say I provided all the answers in that book. My book was aimed at presenting that general theory. But I am thinking about the other questions as well. And so there may be some more coming up in the future, let's put it that way. I could say a lot more about it, but we could also engage in a conversation. So if there are any questions, be happy to answer.
Well, I'll ask one. When you talk about relating the models, like say from one type of system to another, I mean the theories, do you mean models? For instance, when I was working with the exoplanet group and the brown dwarf group at NASA, we would use physical principles and apply them to the parameters for a particular star or planet, the atmosphere of such, and then run the numbers and create a model for like what would be the temperature and pressure. So essentially we'd model the system for each one, but using more general principles. Is that kind of what you're saying, or?
Yeah, that is something you can certainly do. But what I would argue is that the atmosphere or the outer layer of whatever globe you find in the universe cannot be immediately reduced to that theory that I just mentioned, even though it plays a part of it. But every level of complexity gets its own dynamics, so to speak. And that's simply because the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And that's the dynamics that you get with higher levels of complexity. And I'm sure you must be familiar with that. Because even if you model an exoplanet with all those, let's say, physical parameters, what about if it had life? I mean, and suddenly you would find yourself modeling something entirely different. Well, not entirely different, but quite radically different, possibly. What if the Earth didn't have life? What would it look like? And then maybe you see the relative autonomy of the importance of life in the biosphere and the outer shell of the planet. And now I'm already beginning to touch upon the book that I'm currently writing, that I hope will be published next year. Sort of expect that. But I don't want to give away all those ideas yet. That's perhaps for another meeting when the book has been published. But surely, let's say, using those basic principles, you will find yourself creating dynamics that are relatively autonomous of the principles themselves. They're not completely autonomous, but they have their own dynamics. Just like any society has its own dynamics. In terms of how we conceptualize societies, in terms of interdependent people and networks of interdependent people. But these networks are not controlled by anyone, even though some people try. But nobody controls the dynamics of the United States as a whole, or Holland as a whole, or the world population as a whole. It has its own dynamics that is relatively autonomous of all the actions and intentions of all the people who are part of it. Does that make sense?
Could you, just one question, could you give some example about relative autonomy?
Say that again, please.
What could be an example for relative autonomy?
Relative autonomy. Mm-hmm. Well, the idea is that, let's say, we humans, for instance, we depend on the ecology of the planet. We are not completely independent from it. At the same time, our behavior is not completely determined by the ecology of the planet. So there is a certain relative autonomy, you could argue, of human behavior with regard to the rest of the biosphere. We can do all kinds of things, yet we are also dependent on it. So we are not completely autonomous. You could say partially autonomous, but the term relative or autonomy is in use, but partial autonomy would also be fine. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you. And maybe I'll jump in with one more question. I was wondering, when you spoke about energy flows before, what would be also like some examples with regards to complexity?
Well, if you think of energy flows, you see them all around. And the problem is that therefore they may be so hard to see, just like the Goldilocks circumstance. As soon as, just imagine, as soon as we stop breathing, it's the end of our complexity. And certainly after a while, if you stop eating or drinking, it's also the end. So we need our energy intake. You need your oxygen to burn all the stuff that you've eaten to keep your complexity going. Otherwise, you lose your complexity. And that's just an example, but that happens with all of life. But if you want to get a mountain, you need the dynamics of plate tectonics. It doesn't happen all by itself. And so you need the energy flow from inside the earth, bubbles up the stuff and makes the plate flow and creates mountains. And the same with the sun. If the sun wouldn't have its nuclear fusion reactions inside, it would stop shining and would collapse into the end.
Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question about the study of big history as an academic pursuit. And you mentioned Professor Chason before, but it does seem like, departments of physics and astrophysics, I guess actually people studying, cosmology in particular would be a natural place to look for other people studying these processes. I think, astrophysics and cosmology are inherently big history. There's no way around that. But have you also found like other disciplines that seem to naturally lend themselves to big history, and maybe also like other scholars that you've found, the last several years maybe have been studying along the same lines?
Yes, well, obviously, as you're saying, astronomers, astrophysicists, cosmologists, they are very much in favor of big history because that's what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So you have to be right. Also, I have found that geologists also tend to be very sympathetic towards it. And in the United States, in San Francisco, actually. Walter Alvarez did his big history course for a couple of years, I think for 5 or 6 years at least. I guess you know Walter Alvarez by name. He was the one who, together with his father, proposed this theory of a meteorite hitting the Earth and then ending the reign of the dinosaurs, formulated in simple terms. And he found, and not only they formulated a theory, but they found the first evidence for it. And that was a layer of enriched in iridium that they found in Italy, in a place called Gubbio. And actually, he took us there.
Oh, nice.
We hacked our own iridium out of that layer.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah. But yes, so geologists, I would say, biologists, it varies. If they are evolutionary biologists, I think they can be quite sympathetic. If they're more specialized, it may vary. But I would say that the more specialized and small scale the academic specialists are, the less interest they show toward big history in general. But especially from the natural sciences, I think we've always had great support. That has been our power base, so to speak.
Yeah, that does seem to make sense given the nature of those particular fields. One of the other things I was also thinking is that just in academia, there's certain kind of like boundaries or like turf, like, you know, where like some fields, it's like they have a natural inclination to not step outside because it's like, oh no, that's another department. No, like, you know, we can't go there. Yeah.
Yes,
Mark,
well,
I see you have a, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, what I found is that quite often you can find individuals who are interested, but the institutional boundaries are very strong because that's where the money is divided, right? So that's where the energy flows are. And they don't go outside of the boundaries. And that's why you find it's very difficult to get big history established at university because you need money for it. You need money to get that type of complexity.
Right.
And therefore you need some kind of a place where that money is flowing. And that is the biggest problem because all the money flows are inside the departments, most of it. And even if they stimulate inter-department cooperation, then those are projects, but nothing really institutional at a large scale. So I think if you want to institutionalize these courses, you need a different university structure, and you need to reward stepping out of the boundaries. Right now, the rewards are inside the boundaries. That's where all the prizes are. That's where your publications are rated, etc.
Right.
So there are no rewards or hardly any rewards for stepping outside the boundaries. Basically, you get punished by doing that.
Yeah.
So that is what sadly our universities have become most of the time. And if you go back to the 19th century, there were some of these pioneers who were really thinking broadly, but quite often they were not at universities either. I'm thinking of Alexander von Humboldt, who first lived off his inheritance and then later became a chamberlain to the German emperor. And Charles Darwin also lived off an inheritance and could do all his things and was able to think more broadly as a result. But there was a tendency for people to think more broadly then than later in the 19th century, when all these specializations started to emerge and sort of harden out. And that is what making it very difficult to integrate our knowledge again.
Yeah.
So also, there's been a big struggle during my entire career.
Indeed. I can see that Mark has his hand raised.
Yeah.
I do. Actually, some of the challenges for big history crossing borders, like in departments, may actually be some of the same challenges that affect some of the organizations that are working in the energy area. There may be boundaries, but there are also maybe people don't know how to relate to it. I'm not sure. But the question I want to ask is going back to your talk about like plate tectonics and stuff and processes. Do you view like parts of humanity as just another process like plate tectonics or atmospheric phenomenon?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so when people talk about like radiating entropy, they're talking about like the creation of dissipative mechanisms. For instance, a hurricane is a way to expel entropy, or at least get it out of the Earth atmosphere faster. Do you view historical processes as dissipative mechanisms?
That's an interesting question. We all are, in a way, because that's the only way complexity can exist. So you can argue that, yes, the growth of human numbers and the intensity of the way humans interact with the rest of nature must increase the dissipation of energy in form of entropy, you could argue. At the same time, we are reducing the complexity of the biosphere big time. We have been doing that for a long time, actually. I would argue certainly with the beginning of agriculture, but you may argue even with the beginning of the domestication of fire. That's
so are you saying that? Oh, go on.
So you could even argue that the domestication of fire is such a mechanism.
So would you say, it sounds like there's a kind of a struggle between the growth of complexity being a dissipative mechanism versus the actual dissipation, or?
Well, we are lucky that we can dissipate a lot of it out into the universe. And because the universe is getting bigger and bigger, it's like a trash can that's getting bigger and bigger. And so in that respect, we don't have much of a problem. And the Earth is very small compared to the rest of the universe. So that really hardly affects the rest of the universe.
I'm going again into more of the history part of big history. What human processes or historical processes would you see as dissipative mechanisms?
It's a good question. I would need to think a little more about it in detail, but they all are, because you cannot get complexity without it. So all emergence of complexity and continued existence of it, they are dissipative mechanisms. There can be no doubt about it. But how that would work out in terms of numbers and interrelations, I would say, I don't know. It's an interesting field that may not yet have been explored very well.
So another quick question is, the organizations in this lecture series involve, say, energy accounting. I know I certainly have an interest in that as well. When societies are accounting energy, like for instance, it could be for industrial processes, it could be the amount of energy used to make a product. Given that some of these processes may be dissipative mechanisms, what do you think society should be counting in terms of energy or entropy or that sort of thing to, say, improve governance?
Well, I think it would be very important to understand this underlying mechanism, that it works for all of us, and that it is what keeps all of human history and all our enterprises going. And I think it helps to simplify lots of problems. And I've seen the US government try to avoid its debt ceiling, right? That's basically trying to see whether we can borrow more money, so attract more energy flows to keep our complexity going, right? That is the bottom line of what's happening. How long that will last, we don't know, but it's the same principle. And how to account for all of that, how to It's a difficult question, but I would say we need to take into account all the aspects of what we are using. I had a discussion about it with my older brother the other day about, you know what, it may be the case that if you fly from Amsterdam to London, that you're producing more CO2 than if you go by train. But what if you count all the costs that there are to build all the infrastructure and to maintain it? With airplanes, you don't have to maintain only 2 airports, and that's it. You can also fly in a straight line. Well, if you go by train, you make quite a detour, and you have all these rails and whatever to keep these trains going. And if you calculate all of that, then it may turn out that planes may be more environmentally friendly than trains, actually. It's not so easy to calculate all that, but you have to take into account everything that we are doing and what all the costs are in terms of energy, materials, and also getting materials involves energy. So I would say it's not only energy, but it is a very important aspect of the equation, and it is something that is clearly getting more scarce. And at the same time, there's more and more people on the planet, at least for the time being, who all want more things, more energy. So that's, in a quick summary, the situation we find ourselves in. Is that any answer to your question?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's a partial answer. So Chris, that's a big topic of discussion, but thanks. We're coming to the end of the hour. Are there any other questions?
Yes, if you don't mind, I just have one quick question, sir. So piggybacking off of Mark's previous question, how in depth does your research in big history go in terms of the flow of energy or energy consumptions in terms of work statistics, production, labor? You're talking about the invention of fire and all of that nature. How does it go any further to like the invention of fire, to the utilization of coal and fossil fuels, to the utilization of, like, in the end, nuclear power in terms of civilization's ability to produce more goods and distribution? Over.
Yeah, so basically you sketch the general pattern very well. But of course, the problem is how to get more in depth, and there are limits to what a single person can do, right? So what I think is that we can try to look at the literature, whatever numbers there are, we could try to collect. And then we could also try to determine where the gaps are, what we really like to know, what we don't know. And there are lots of things we probably never going to know. How much energy, for instance, these Paleolithic people used. How would we know? We can produce our estimates, but we cannot really go back in time. So what you see is, if you look at the things, that enormous research agendas are opening up, and of things that may be partially known in the literature, but perhaps not that much. But it would require a lot of effort to put that together. And I think 10 years ago, I formulated such a project and tried to get research money for it, but they didn't stand a chance because, well, they said, okay, not here, go to the next. So in the end, I had to submit it by at the geologist section of the Dutch Science Foundation. No chance, because they wanted to reward their own fellows, right? So what you see is that if you start such research projects, you need interdisciplinary support. If not, you find yourself basically on your own. And I think I consider myself lucky that I have been able to formulate some of these general patterns. And in some ways, I have gone in depth, such as in my Peru research, where I also looked at how much money the church income was and what they were spending it on and how we were dealing with that and how they maintained their complexity, so to speak. But I think there is still, enormous room for improvement in our knowledge. Yeah, at the beginning.
Thank you. Thanks, sir. Yeah, so Mark, I'm with Technocracy Incorporated, so we're definitely interested in energy consumption, how that affects civilization's progress and advances. So Mark was very kind to introduce me to your lecture today and invite me, so I'm very glad I attended.
Oh, thank you.
Some context. By the way, if anyone has to leave, feel free to. I'll be happy to stick around for a while. Technocracy, when it was founded, did actually an incredible amount of energy accounting and created a baseline and some of the theory for that. The other group I told you about, Emergy Systems, the University of Florida folks, they are probably the current leader in some ways in energy accounting, although exactly what they're counting isn't necessarily the same thing as Technocracy or even myself would count, but it's of interest. They treat energy kind of like voltages. They're much more concerned about the quality of energy and how the quality degrades as you go through a process. But they've created quite a few databases. They've gotten some grant money, but often in the sense of like ecology or environmental approaches, like cleanup approaches and things like that. But like I said, Parker will be part of a presentation by Technocracy Inc., I think on October 24th. Does that sound right?
I'll have to look through my schedule. To be honest with you, it's been a bit busy. And so I'll kind of catching things as they fall out of the air. But I do remember this coming along. It should be good. Whatever data I sent you last time should still be good. And so I should need to double check that, but everything should still be running smoothly so far. Over.
Okay, so we'll have Parker, and then I believe it's Executive Director of Technocracy, Charmy Gilcrease, presenting then. European Organization of Sustainability will present on October 11th. This is just the way the dates worked out, not necessarily priority of the organizations. We're trying to get Emergy Systems. I'm a member, but I don't think I would be the best person to present it. So just in some arms over, just because I want you guys to know about each other. And then I actually, what you guys don't talk about, I'll probably fill in afterwards, and then maybe talk about some of the historical processes and things like that. An interesting thing on television, I don't know if you've seen it, there was a series of books called The Foundation by Isaac Asimov. I don't know if you've read those.
No,
they're talking about kind of a science of history, of human history, not necessarily big history, but that sort of thing. It's now finally, after years of trying, it's on Apple TV. We're up to episode 3 now. Of course, they totally distort the ideas in the science fiction books very badly, but that's something that's coming out, and that might increase interest in things like big history and related areas, and maybe energy governance and that sort of thing. And if you have any suggestions for people for this series, I'd love to hear about them, bring them in. We have invitation out to Lib Thims of the Encyclopedia of Human Thermodynamics. He's talking more interpersonal type of relations, how thermodynamics might govern those. He's, I think, also a chemist type. I think he might be in med school now. But he's like trying to model people as molecules and that sort of thing. Like I said, I think each one of these things has some validity, but not necessarily unlimited validity. But we'd love to hear from him. I don't know if we'll get him, but we're trying. And right now, does anyone have any ideas that people bring in? Might as well fish you now instead of bugging you with email later.
Well, I would suggest next to Eric Chason, also Václav Smil from the University of Manitoba, who's a great energy specialist.
Oh, who is that? I don't know that.
Václav Smil. I'll send you the name.
Okay.
I have a couple of his books.
Okay, then you can communicate.
Yeah, he would be ideal.
Okay. Well, thank you, Fred, very much. I appreciate you coming. Let's give him a round of applause.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for
attention.
taking the time to speak with us, and thank you, Mark, for organizing this too.
Oh, come on. Microphone's on when you're doing the round of applause, guys.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I have to do the same to my class guest speakers. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.